Welcome to this webinar on improving rural mobility with demand responsive transport. I'm your host, Elise McCallum. Thank you to everyone who's joining just as we pop in. Today we're going to hear from members of Liftango and East Yorkshire buses, part of the Go Ahead group. We're going to unpack data-driven service design for demand responsive transport and showcase the launch of the on-demand service, Just Go Northlinks, a collaboration between Liftango, North Lincolnshire Council and East Yorkshire buses. Today's webinar will be broken up into 5 parts. First up, we will discuss data-driven service design. After that, we'll look at co-creating the Just Go Northlinks DRT service. We'll then follow up with a section on adopting a passenger-centric approach, and our final presentation will dive into the future outlook of DRT. We'll then close the webinar with 15 minutes of questions for our panel members. Now, feel free to submit your questions via the question box at any time during the webinar, and we'll get to it at the end. So to kick off, I now have the pleasure of introducing our first presenter, David Mawhinney. David Mawhinney is head of Liftango UK and is responsible for UK operations. He's also Liftango's application specialist in data science. I'll now turn it over to you, David, to present on data-driven service design.
Thanks, Elise. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to start by briefly talking about what demand responsive transport is. I think since you've signed up for this, probably safe to assume that you already have some interest and understanding, but there are quite a few different flavors of DRT. So we're seeing use cases across public, corporate and community transport, and the Just Go service that we're going to talk about today actually sits across public and community transport. So DRT isn't anything new. It's been around for a long time, traditionally in the form of dial-a-ride type services. But what is new is the software that's available to power these services. So routing and scheduling can now be done dynamically. It allows us to take on-demand bookings, take bookings through mobile apps, and these same mobile apps can provide things like real-time journey information. So it's a greatly improved passenger experience, and that automated routing allows for optimization as well. So it's a benefit to operators too. If we look next at where DRT works, or on the next slide, the most common use case we're seeing in the UK at the moment is for underserved rural areas. So these are traditionally quite hard to serve with fixed routes. There might be gaps in the service, or maybe gaps in the timetable or physical gaps between the routes, and DRT can help to plug those gaps. We also see applications across urban areas too. Here, the challenge is around designing a service which integrates well with other transport modes. So it takes careful design to make sure it's not cannibalizing passengers from other modes of public transport. Pretty much the worst use case for DRT is for it to follow along behind a fixed route, taking passengers off that bus. The best services in these areas work more like feeder services, so perhaps a first mile, last mile setup, so taking people from their door to connect them to other modes for their onward journey. Now, the Just Go region actually covers all of these elements. It's a huge zone. It's over 500 square miles. Half the population is in Scunthorpe in the centre, and the rest spread around a largely rural area. So the challenge here is designing something that works well for all of these elements. And it's that design process I'm going to talk to you about today. Just before I do that, I think it's worth touching on a few of the other problems that DRT helps to solve. You might recognise some of these from your own local area. I think for me, the main ones are the ones that help to drive efficiencies. So I think we've all probably seen double-decker buses driving around with 1 or 2 people, or perhaps nobody on them, ghost buses as they're referred to here, and all the excess driving and waste that entails. But for me, as a self-confessed data nerd, the bit that I get most excited about is the opportunity to collect better data. I think that has been lacking in the past, and that limits the sort of optimization and learning that we can do. If we look at why data is so important, then over on the next slide, it's important at every phase of the design process. So right at the outset, then when we're identifying opportunities, it can help us to see where public transport's working well at the moment, perhaps where it's not working so well, where the gaps are, where DRT might be able to help. Once we've identified those areas, we can move then into the second phase, into the more detailed design part. So we can start to run in-depth simulations to start answering questions about what DRT might look like for an area. How do we best design it to serve that community? And then also after launch, data is the vital component in the ongoing management, improvement and optimization of any service. And it's these 3 elements we're going to look at in more detail over on the next slides. So yeah, at the beginning then, when we're looking at identifying opportunities, before we dive into what DRT might look like, it's obviously best to look at the existing transportation that's available in an area. Lots of different ways of doing this. We use a tool that we've built called Transit Scan. And what this allows us to do is a wide area scan to look at public transport provision and quickly pick out the gaps. So we look at various different metrics here. We can look at, for example, public transport journey times, compare those to the equivalent drive to see how attractive public transport might be. We can map out walking times from each point to the nearest bus stop, or perhaps the number of connections people have to make to get to the town centre or another key destination. So that allows you to very quickly build up a picture of where the gaps are. It helps you to start to develop the business cases and identify the areas for the more in-depth simulation work that we'll talk about on the next slide. So by simulation, what I mean here is when we start to model people and vehicles moving around in a virtual DRT system. Now, we've been doing this for a long time, and we've learned three key things about making this a success, getting the most out of this process. So the first is using the same technology in your simulations that you're going to use in your real world service. We've been brought into projects where consultants have maybe done that modeling first, but then you can get yourself into a bit of hot water when the real service doesn't bear much resemblance because the consultants didn't have access to the technology that actually runs the buses. So to be confident of assessing the real world outcomes, it's important to have some consistency there. Next thing that's important is to set the goals right at the outset. Sorry, just go back a slide. That's it. Yeah, is to set clear goals right at the outset. So the goals can often be competing. So if you think about perhaps the efficiency of the vehicles versus the customer experience, there can be some trade-off there. So it's important for all parties to set what good looks like before you go through this process. And the final thing is following a framework, and it's that framework that's on the slide here. So we're using an 8-step process across 2 phases. First phase is to look at the feasibility. Is DRT right for this area at all? Assuming it is, move on to the second phase, which gets into the more detailed design work. Quickly, just taking these points in turn then, first thing we need to do is the trip demand projection. So you might already have data from an existing service. In the case of Just Go, we had data from the Coal Connect community transport service. If you don't have that, there's enough experience around now with launching similar schemes that we can begin to model demand ranges. The next few steps look at initial zone, service, and fleet design. Here it's really important to work in partnership, to have people around the table who not only understand DRT, but also have lots of deep local knowledge about the area, so you can come up with designs that make sense for that community. We can then run through the first set of simulations and use those outputs to assess feasibility. Very open about the fact that DRT isn't the answer to every transport problem, and it's much better to find out at this stage rather than halfway through an expensive launch. Assuming everything looks good on the feasibility side, move on to the detailed design phase. Here, there's an opportunity to reassess your goals. Given the outputs from the first simulations, do those goals make sense? Are they realistic? Do they need to change in any way? And then over the next couple of steps, we can start to refine that design, work through lots of different iterations to try different configurations. We might look at a point-to-point type service or point-to-hub, look at different levels of demand, perhaps to model busy days and quiet days, and then the number of vehicles that are needed at each stage to make the level of service that's required. Example, for Just Go, we looked through lots of different customer experience settings. So an example might be the maximum allowable journey time. So that's effectively how much we're allowing the buses to deviate to pick up additional passengers. And we can see the impact that has on the number of vehicles that's required to maintain that level of service. The output from this should be an optimal design. It helps to de-risk the launch process and remove as many of those unknowns as possible. But the design process doesn't finish with launch. It's a continuous optimization process. So once the service starts, begin to collect huge amounts of data, and we can use that to track the key metrics against the goals that we've set. We can also monitor the impact of any service changes that are made, so we can make sure that they have the desired outcome. And if we have any major changes to make, can also simulate those before we make them. So we can effectively replay days. So you can take the demand from a previous day, run it again with different settings, and see the impact that that has. So the example of this for the Just Go service is we recently simulated the additional bus that's just been added. So we took the demand that we already had, ran through lots of different configurations to see how we best use that asset to help meet our aims. And as I say, it's a continuous process. So now that North Lincolnshire's been awarded some of the rural mobility funding, we'll be going through the same process again, so that any future expansion of the service, that will simulate the changes ahead of time and make sure that it's going to have the most benefit and can continue to improve things. And that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, David. And if you have any other questions for David or another panel member, please submit your questions as we go. Now, I'm really pleased to introduce Ben Gilligan, Area Director of East Yorkshire Buses. Ben has worked in the bus sector for almost 2 decades and comes with a wealth of experience, having multiple senior and operational leadership roles within government and private enterprises. Let's hear from Ben now as he talks about the co-creation of Just Go North Links.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Elise. So just to sort of start from the beginning of this with us. So we, and also talk about North Lincolnshire. North Lincolnshire's a fairly rural community, fairly rural county, south of the River Humber. Lots of fairly small settlements, limited public transport in some respects, although there are good connections in and around Scunthorpe and then more sort of interurban services. However, many of those were reliant on support from North Lincolnshire Council, alongside previous Call Connect DRT service, which I'll touch on in a moment. We can just move on to the next slide. So the tender was issued in 2019 by North Lincolnshire Council to replace the Call Connect service. And a key part of their tender specification was about delivering a transformative demand responsive transport system that would target new types of customers. So that was moving away from the traditional image of DRT, which is around the sort of typical dial-a-ride service, mostly focused on older, retired people, maybe people with limited mobility, and trying to target a more commercial type of passengers, commuters, students, people out for leisure visits. And the technology was going to be a very key part of that, alongside replacing some of the existing tendered services. So this was issued in 2019, and we decided we were going to start to have a look at it. If we move on to the next slide, please. So ahead of us actually deciding that we were going to bid for this service, we had a chat to a number of technology providers in the market, and we selected Liftango because we felt that the technology that was on offer most met the requirements of both ourselves and, more importantly, North Lincolnshire and their specification, due to the flexibility of the platform, but also in particular the ability to be able to book in advance. So whilst it is a demand responsive service, there's also a key need to be able to accommodate those that want to plan their journeys ahead. And we felt that sort of the ability to meet both of those requirements was Liftango were most suitable. Once we were awarded the contract in February 2020, we worked with the Liftango team to do some modelling that would allow us to build the service and understand what kind of resource was going to be needed, what sort of times would that resource have to be, where would it have to go on the network, and although we had very limited data to work on from the existing Call Connect service, there was enough to start to build that meant that we could get to a position that when we launched the service, we knew roughly what we needed to do and where the vehicles and drivers needed to be. So moving on to the impact on us of taking on this service. So it's the first time as an operator we have done DRT at East Yorkshire Buses. There is experience within the Go Ahead group of demand responsive services with the Oxford Pick Me Up service and the pilot that was running TfL up until COVID-19 pandemic. But essentially for us as a bus operator, a lot of the basics are the same. We still have to maintain vehicles, we still have to provide drivers, but it's a very different way of allocating work to our drivers. So most bus drivers now, they have a duty, they know where they're going to be at what time, they follow a schedule. With this, it's much more flexible. They know when they're starting, when they're finishing, they know what time their meal break's going to be and when it's going to be. But in between that, our drivers don't know what they're doing until the next pickup. So that's been quite a change for us in terms of how we manage the team. And it needs, I guess, a sort of different mentality and approach by the driving team. Clearly, for rural communities, DRT can be transformative in terms of improving access to services. So there's many parts of North Lincolnshire that don't have a regular scheduled bus service now, and DRT is very much filling the gaps of that, and giving them buses more at a time when they want to get them. So the service was actually launched during COVID. So in many ways, we've never run Just Go outside in what we'd call normal times. So we were originally due to launch service in June of 2020. Obviously, that wasn't a good time to mobilise a service, so we agreed that we would launch it in September 2020 when the restrictions were reduced. It also meant that the supply chain, in terms of getting vehicles ready, being able to train drivers, all the sort of things that you need to do to get things right on day one. It gave us proper time to do those over the summer, although the mobilisation was still a very busy time, lots to do in a very small period of time. As soon as we launched the service, we were obviously running under the sort of capacity restrictions that we have across our regular scheduled vehicles. So at the moment, we can only carry 50% of the plated capacity of the vehicle. But I think the important thing is we launched this service and it's continued to operate through the 2 lockdowns we've had since it started. But I think it's also given us an opportunity to revise elements of the service to make it meet the requirements more effectively. And what I mean by that is, from very early on, we were able to start to see where the demand was, what time it was, when people wanted to travel, so that we've been able to constantly model the service with our colleagues from Liftango. And that has been good, because there's been a number of tweaks we've made to various elements of it that have actually increased the ability to carry, or it has increased our ability to carry more people during the course of the operating day. For instance, we've made changes to the booking window and the flexibility in terms of people's requests for pick up and drop off times, which just creates more capacity within the service. More recently, we've deployed additional resource within the service, which has been funded by North Lincolnshire Council, and that's all about confidence building as we come out of this, come out of the pandemic. So clearly demand has increased in the last couple of weeks, and it was really important that we were able to work with our customers, work with North Lincolnshire in order to allow more people who want to travel to be able to travel on the bus. So in terms of the key learnings that we can take away from this, so I think for us as an operator, we've learned a lot about DRT and how it works. And I think that's been critical, because you can do these studies on paper, you can attend webinars, but actually until you're out there delivering it, you don't necessarily understand how it works. And we did spend a lot of time with our colleagues in Oxford looking at their DRT service that they were running up to the pandemic. But obviously we're in a very rural area where we're operating this, which brings about different challenges, and it's a different way of operating. And I'll touch on that again in a moment. Collaborative changes have been really important. So we've been having regular conference calls with Liftango and with North Lincolnshire Council, talking about our experiences, talking about the experiences of our customers. And that's allowed us to make changes to improve things as we go along. But it's also allowed us, as I said earlier, to model things as we go along, which means that every decision we make is based on fact and real data, rather than what we think we might need to do. And I think that is critical, because it's very easy to assume that what is right or what is wrong, but actually backing it up with the data, being able to model it and see the impact of it, is critical. Having said that, we do need to be responsive. Liftango have been very keen to implement changes quickly where we have found issues. For instance, customer messaging on the app, we've changed some of that. We've changed some of the zones that we operate in to be able to reduce the risk of abstracting from the commercial network, which is going to be particularly critical, particularly when the government's CBSSG funding ends. But I think another part around this is around managing expectations, because it is a big change in culture for people to actually have to book a bus, but also there are limited resources out there, and people have to understand that, you know, you may want a bus at 9 o'clock, but you might not be able to get one at 9 o'clock, but you might be able to get one at 9:15, or it might have to stop off and pick other people up on the way. And it's been really critical that we explain that to people to avoid the risk of them being disappointed. And I think as we come out of the pandemic and passenger numbers do pick up, and funnily enough, today I think we're carrying the highest number of people we've carried throughout the whole of the time that we've been running this service. I think it's really important that we do explain to people, you know, how it works and what they might expect when they're booking, so that they're not disappointed, and so that we can carry as many people as possible who want to use public transport. I think the final point I would make is, I think DRT is very different between rural and urban areas. I think in urban areas, journey times do take longer, people are on the bus for longer, and you perhaps need a more flexible approach that's maybe less of a demand responsive side and a bit more of a sort of flexible service side than you might get in an urban area. And I think that to all the local authorities that are interested in this, I think understanding that kind of market is very, very crucial if you choose to go down this route, which, you know, DRT is a solution to some of the problems we have, particularly in rural areas, but it also needs to be treated differently from urban areas. So that's all from me. Thank you for listening, and I'm sure I'll be able to answer some questions later.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Ben. That was really insightful. The team at East Yorkshire Buses have had some incredible successes despite the challenges that you've faced over the last year. So we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us. I'm now excited to let you know that we're going to hear from Rhys Plater, Marketing Officer at East Yorkshire Buses. Rhys has been heavily involved with the communication strategy of Just Go and has worked on multiple international projects in the 5 years he's been with East Yorkshire Buses, some incorporating demand responsive transport. So Rhys is now going to share his team's experience on creating a passenger-centric approach for DRT operations.
Thanks, Liz, and good morning, everybody. Yes, I'll dive a little bit deeper into Just Go North Links, continuing from what Ben's been talking about and looking at the passenger side of things. So firstly, personalising the passenger experience and Just Go as a whole. Well, we have a team of 11 drivers in Just Go, plus some relief drivers led by our DRT supervisor and supported by our day-to-day control operations. But a big part of it is our call centre. We have a call centre based in our Hull depot, integrating our existing call centre, but with a dedicated line. So we know who's calling through, and passengers know that they'll always be answered by a Just Go representative. But we needed to ensure we hit the ground running with Just Go. So we launched a comprehensive marketing campaign prior to and throughout the launch period, incorporating out-of-home adverts, targeted digital radio adverts, roadshows at markets and in town centres, plenty of PR, letters targeted by location, partnering with North Lincolnshire Council, as well as the buses themselves being around in the communities during our testing. And this was a real success. In the first week, we were really pleased with how the service went. So what about DRT versus fixed route services in terms of passengers? Well, the main thing is passenger requirements are captured in advance. Passengers know what they'll get and when. They know they'll get a seat on a bus. They'll know they'll get the bus and driver they're told to expect. And so both the customer and the driver know they're on the right vehicle going to the right place when they board. While as an operator, we know that every journey will have a passenger and that there'll be no buses running around empty. And personalisation is important too. So for the passenger, it means they'll only have a short walk to their bus at the time that they either request it or close to that. to the exact place that they want to go. There's no changes, it's all paid for in advance, and it's closer to their exact needs than the fixed route services may be, depending on where they live. And it means they don't have to travel certain routes at certain times. It's a little bit more flexible, and it's particularly the case in rural locations where there are a few fixed route buses. And personalisation and accessibility come in together too. So personalisation is really key for the confidence of those with additional needs. Passengers know that if they book a wheelchair seat, they'll get it, and they'll not have to wait for the next bus, which may be an hour away in rural locations. And roughly 5% of our passengers last week requested a wheelchair space, which is a substantial percentage, and it's higher than the number we'd normally get on our fixed route buses. And also the driver knows the needs of the customer before they arrive, so they can help accordingly. The passenger doesn't have to ask for it if they don't need to. So if the passenger does need a wheelchair ramp, the driver can get preparing that as soon as the driver pulls up, avoiding delays for other passengers while maintaining the excellent customer care throughout. And if a passenger can't walk to their nearest meeting point, they can request a location. They can request the meeting point added closer, providing it's obviously safe for the bus to stop there. Ben touched on education, and that's a really important point, and it was important around our launch too. Just goes a new concept to a lot of people. So yes, we had Call Connect available, and some of our passengers use that. But for many others, it needs explaining, and some of the Call Connect users won't have used the technology aspect. Many passengers will be used to a bus an hour or no buses at all. So the education through roadshows, getting out to talk to people, PR, and the call centre itself is important. And the app helps with that too. It helps you guide you through the process. And once you've used it a couple of times, it's quite easy to get your head around it. If you said the words demand responsive transport to someone not in the industry, they probably won't know what you mean. And it's important to reiterate too that it's not Uber. It is a bus service, and it is to be booked in advance. And of course, it brings with it challenges in serving rural areas. And in North Lincolnshire, it's a large area to cover with a small number of buses. So the education around encouraging people to book at quieter times if they're not travelling where they have to be there at a certain point. And a lot of our passengers are travelling for leisure, so a slightly later departure in order to get where they're going and to fit in with the rest of the passengers and buses is great. And DRTs is obviously for where fixed services won't work. If they did, we'd be running them, such as the key routes into the city centres. So what about the human aspect? Well, the call centre is really important to start with. The app's great, and it'll always offer the best user experience, being able to track the bus and see when it's going to arrive. But it doesn't mean the experience doesn't have to be excellent when someone chooses not to use it. A lot of our customers don't use it because they don't have the technology or don't understand it, and that's fine. But the call centre is also a stepping stone to people using the app. They can explain it to people, help with any issues they may be having, and take time to talk them through it. And also there may be times that people need an instant answer. So the call centre is always open during the same hours that the service runs. What happens when there's a breakdown or if someone loses something on board? It's really important to have that human input available. And this is the same with the drivers. It's fine having the best buses, best app, best call centre, but if the actual experience of the bus journey itself isn't good, then that's what people will remember and tell their friends about. We're lucky to have a fantastic team of drivers and staff across our whole East Yorkshire bus operations, and we were awarded for that and commended for that at the Heart of East Yorkshire Awards this week. But it's even more important on a DRT service where drivers are getting to know the passengers perhaps a little bit closer because there's fewer passengers on board, and getting to know the local community. And drivers also spend a lot of time on their own, away from colleagues. They don't learn routes. So the driving skills around the small North Lincolnshire roads need to be top notch. So in the week before launch, we held joint training sessions and workshops with Liftango, focusing on customer service, how DRT is different to normal service buses that drivers may be used to, and also how the technology works, including letting drivers have a go with it on the road with vehicles and pretending to be customers booking journeys themselves. And this training continues, so that's the same for new drivers, shadowing existing drivers and particularly having the training on the technology side of the service before carrying passengers on the road, because it is more than just driving, it's also having awareness of the journeys through the tablet. And DRT allows for data-driven decision-making through reports, performance, and improvements. Okay, so we had a little bit of data before we got going, but you don't really get real data before you're operating the service day to day, seeing what journey times are like, seeing how people book and how they travel. But by gathering this data, you can improve and make tweaks to improvements. For example, the time allocated to wheelchairs was far too much, as the ramp was much easier to operate than we first thought. So we reduced this time and increased capacity. The same around travel times across the region, and also the locations of meal breaks, start and end locations. And this kind of continuous improvement allows for an improving experience for our customers. But what do our customers think? Well, we received lots of testimonials and comments from our passengers by letter, telephone, and social media. I've put 3 up on the screen there. I can't read these out, don't quite have time, but the common theme is always around the friendliness of drivers and the cleanliness of vehicles, which is really important during the pandemic, but it shows the overall picture and the overall positivity of the service. And so we're just going into the Just Go achievements. And this is where I'll finish. So a big thing is key workers and vaccination centres. The importance of the service throughout the 2nd and 3rd lockdowns that we've all been through, so for people to make essential journeys in the area is really clear. Even though the service was new, it helped key workers get to work. And the fleet expansion that Ben mentioned, as a result of the high demand and the lifting restrictions on 12th of April, it was great to be able to put an extra vehicle in to allow for that extra leisure travel and non-essential journeys. And part of this is also people travelling to vaccination centres across the region. In North Lincolnshire, there's vaccination centres across the area. Some of them are small surgeries, and some people travelling to them may not have been out of the house for a year, certainly in the first few months of the programme. So Just Go is a safe and reliable option. It's pre-booked, there's no overcrowding, there's social distancing guaranteed, and there's hand sanitizer available on every bus, as well as our enhanced cleaning. And it was interesting that we only saw a 25% drop in patronage during lockdown, whereas it was up to around 60% in the latest lockdowns, and even higher in the first, which indicates the reliance of the service for key workers and essential journeys. And the fact it didn't reduce operating hours or number of vehicles helps people feel a little bit safer on a smaller pre-booked bus with fewer passengers on board. But how does the app integrate with fixed route services? Well, this is something we've really developed since launch, and through successful updates made by Liftango within the app, we've been able to encourage those with options for regular bus services to be clearer on those services and how you could use them. So the app will tell people the bus they can use for the journey and take them to that operator's website for a timetable too, but only if they're within a set walking distance of a stop. And this could be improved further by giving times of the nearest bus within the app itself, and we are exploring this too. And finally, what's next for Just Go North Links? Well, with the recent Rural Mobility Fund, we're exploring with North Lincolnshire Council options around evening buses and buses on Sundays, where there are currently very few across the county. And this would be a really excellent opportunity for us and for the region too, especially as we're looking at rebuilding our economies following the pandemic and encouraging more leisure travel. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Rhys. That was really interesting. I'm sure we'll get some questions about some of what you've addressed later. Now, it's up to our final presentation, and we have Kevin Orr, CEO and co-founder of Liftango. Kevin started Liftango in 2015 with a simple goal: to reduce the number of cars on our roads and to unlock all the good that comes from shared transport. Now we're going to take a look at the future outlook for DRT with Kevin Orr.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Elise, and thanks, Ben, Rhys, and David. I'm really going to spend just a couple of minutes, really, just to sort of tie it all together on what DRT is doing locally in the UK here, and I guess around the world as well. It's DRT or DDRT with what we kind of refer to it as dynamic demand responsive transport with technology. it's still a fairly new concept. We were involved in projects back in 2017 that were considered trials for a number of years. That was really how we started. We've evolved away from a trial market or a trial period now. There's a number of providers that have a lot of experience and knowledge and expertise in this space. And we're also seeing much lengthier, sort of similar sized public transport contracts to really integrate DRT into the existing public transport network and align it accordingly. The reason we've moved away from these early stage trials is many results and studies have found where DRT is beneficial for the taxpayers. I think in the early days, DRT was trialed and implemented in services and areas that it wasn't applicable for. And we've kind of filtered those out and realized where DRT does not work well. However, there is definite value to taxpayers to implement DRT in a kind of specific areas of cities, regional and rural areas specifically has a strong use case and increase to the taxpayers. There was a question I think we'll touch on later around the cost per trip. That's a very good question, and what we've seen overseas is that the longer the DRT services have been running, the lower the cost per trip has become over time. This is due to increasing density, increasing patronage, and I guess acceptance and refinement of the technology evolving as well. There's still many areas around the world where DRT technology can benefit the local communities and the local passengers. And so I think we will see more and more integration of DRT into the public transport network in the years to come. Next slide, please. So to take a look at, I guess, what is driving the implementation of DRT or consideration of DRT. I think Uber is probably a large part to blame or or thank for DRT to come into the public transport bus networks. Definitely overseas in Australia, the transit authorities were looking at how, instead of being disrupted by an Uber-like technology in the way that it did for the taxi industry, how could they be part of the solution? How could they understand how technology can enable, I guess, a more efficient service? And so they launched trials to understand that in the early cases. So bringing that technology in has in a collaborative manner with the transit authorities and councils has been key to DRT's increasing acceptance. Similarly, the leveraging of existing assets in a community by using technology is a key driver of this as well. So looking at what we've done in Just Go, for example, we've taken what were two siloed services in the past and fairly manual. We've kind of joined them together to be a community transport service alongside a commercial service. And similarly, there's other, I guess, applications to bring in similar use cases such as schools or corporate transport or other assets that are available to provide, I guess, a unified way for people to leverage these assets and move around their communities more freely. Secondly, I think the real global push from government, from the very top down, councils as well, to become more sustainable and increase, I guess, shared mobility initiatives is been a key driver. So clearly, DRT has a way to provide a little bit more convenience to the passengers, picking them up a little bit closer, getting them closer to where they want to be dropped off, and obviously a bit more digital communication. That has an effect of getting more people back onto public transport, which has seen a bit of a decline over the past coming years due to various budgetary constraints as well. Moving into, I guess, the current landscape and the impacts of COVID specifically on our society's travel behaviors. It's still a very big unknown how we are going to move around our communities in the future. So a lot of these services have been designed based on data from 10 years, last 10 years previous. But it's still a very big unknown if that's going to be the same going forward. And I think we'll see many previously economical fixed route services that will potentially be struggling for patronage due to the changing of travel behaviors going forward. What's quite good about DRT in this case is it's almost like a safety net. So take the Just Go North links. Should there be any fixed route services that are undesirable or uneconomical and are chosen to stop, there is a safety net for DRT to pick up those passengers that rely on the service and need it to move around the community. So I think in the future, when these things are kind of fleshed out moving forward, having DRT as that safety net is really going to be key to essentially prevent complaints and allow people the freedoms they had before. I know the local MP is very keen to prevent some of the complaints from lack of transport options, which is, I guess, why she's implemented DRT. And similarly, greater value for money. So looking at the existing current pot of money that goes into public transport, and how can we get more out of that pot of money? So leveraging DRT where it makes sense alongside fixed route has economical benefit. Lots of studies on that these days if done correctly. And how can we essentially get the most out of that finite amount of funds? Next slide, please. So where is DRT headed? I think we're going to see more and more use cases being where DRT is applied. I think the schools are seeing more questions, increasing number of potential market sending tenders, for example, coming up around how schools can leverage DRT. This is obviously, there's a level of optimization that's already been done in that space, but I think it's more from the safety angle. How can we provide communication to the parents and the grandparents and just have a little bit more of a safety aspect to the service. Similarly, community transport and public transport coexisting alongside corporate transport potentially being leveraged as well for trips around the community that aren't for staff members or business park staff is a key part. And I know the appetite is strong from the very top, but also down to the sort of community transport operators to implement EVs. It's a little bit difficult, I think, right now with the maturity of the minibus EVs, and the range is still roughly that sort of 100 to potentially 160 miles. And how do you continue to operate in the way you've operated before with these types of constraints? But we have a project over in New Zealand where we're using 6 EV vehicles. There's a lot to learn from that project on how we optimize accordingly. But it's a very key area that we'll see moving forward. And once we solve some of these range anxiety issues, I think we'll see a large increase in EVs into the DRT fleets. And final slide, please, before I wrap up. It's really just to understand that the Just Go service that we launched was extremely challenging. It's a huge area. We previously only done launched DRT in areas that were sort of 15 by 25 sort of miles. So going to 515 square miles was extremely challenging. It was great to see that some of the features that we identified that we needed in advance have worked out. And obviously we've worked closely with Ben and Just Go, the Go Ahead and the council to implement new features to kind of optimize that. But it was really a groundbreaking launch for such a large area, and to commingle the commercial and the community transport trips together. But a really rewarding project. Couldn't have worked without, I guess, the partners sort of talking a lot, working closely, obviously, with Go Ahead and the council. Al Fryer, he needs a mention in the operations team. He's very much on top of everything that's working. Obviously, the drivers are key to any DRT service. They are the face and the front and center of this. And similarly, Ben and Rhys and the team behind the scenes as well. It is a 5-year project, the Just Go service, so we will see continuous evolution of that as we go through this. It's 4 years and 3 months still to go, so there's a lot of challenges still to be solved and worked through. And I guess coming out the side of the worst of COVID, there'll definitely be an uptick in passengers as we're seeing already, but how do we evolve it to increase the operating hours accordingly and keep it within the service levels we have, and also the expectations of the council from the budgetary review. So lots of exciting things to look through as we go forward. And yeah, I think I'll stop there and we'll move on to the Q&A, I believe.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, we will. But just before we turn it over to the panel to answer your questions, I just wanted to let you know that if you would like to learn more about the DRT deployment process and would like a copy of Liftango's 80-page deployment handbook, please get in touch with either David or Kevin and they can send you a copy. So yes, it is now time for questions. So can we get our panelists to turn on their screens and say hello? Awesome. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at some questions here and I will see who wants to ask one. Okay, great. Now we have a question. What are the key considerations when looking at feasibility of DRT in an area? Who would like to answer that one?
Do that one. So yeah, it really does depend on the situation and the aims of what you're trying to do. But the core things will always be around the demand, not just the absolute level of demand, but around what the likely movements are. It's one of the key things we'll put into the process, but it's also what you're trying to achieve. So are you trying to essentially provide the same level of service but reduce costs, or do you have a finite budget and you want to make the most of that? There'll be those kind of benchmarks that we'll use to assess the feasibility. So can we improve the service provision over and above a fixed route by making it into a DRT service?
Cool, thank you for that one, David. So I've got another question. Does the booking system record the number of inquiries that did not result in a booking? That is important to identify unmet demand. Kevin, did you want to answer that one?
Sure, good question. Yeah, I think Ben touched upon this in his part of the presentation. So there is obviously clearly an element of education for the users that it is not an Uber service. So if they do try and get a trip right now and the service is busy, it may result in a no trip or a trip outside of their anticipated leave time. So it could potentially 30 minutes or 1 hour. So what the technology does is it does flex to a degree. So if there is a booking coming in for example, tomorrow at 7:30, which is a particularly busy time for the Just Go service, we will flex either side to try and offer them a trip that can get them onto the service. And we do that at the point of booking, so they can see in advance that it might not be suitable for them. If they have some flexibility, they can accept the trip and move forward. But that trip is guaranteed once they're on the service, so they can be safe and relaxed. What we have, I guess, got in our technology, and that is part of the education phase, is a way for people to kind of adopt the service as an ongoing form of transport. That is their form of transport, to get to work or to get to school or go to the shops. And the further in advance they book, we have a 28-day advanced booking window, the more likelihood there is to get their exact trip time. So that is a bit of an education that happens as new people come onto the service. And we do have a lot of people booking that they know their travel pattern. So they do book 28 days in advance. But then obviously clearly for the people who want to book more ad hoc on that on-demand fashion, we are fitting them around what is an existing subset of sort of loyal, regular users, as you will. And then that's the education phase would start at that point. Say if you do want to get more of a guaranteed trip, it is better to book ahead. And then this is where David is monitoring things fairly closely on the number of how much availability we have in our system and what we can do to kind of keep it in check for the expectations of the passengers.
Yeah, if there is any unmet demand, it is really important for that process I talked about when we replay the days. It will include any unmet demand, so we can see if changing things will help us to meet a higher level of demand. So it's really important part of the process to record that.
Cool, thanks guys. We've got another question here from Robin. How appropriate is DRT for new housing schemes with the challenge of slowly increasing house occupations? Not sure who wants to take that one on. First one to jump in.
Shall I jump in there? Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as a sort of seasoned bus operator, housing developments over the last few years have been very bus unfriendly in many areas, and certainly, you know, the accessibility is a challenge. And I think DRT can be an ideal solution for this, for the simple reason: smaller vehicles, easier to access, greater flexibility. So certainly I think it's part of the solution. I mean, you know, I think ultimately, you know, housing sites should be developed in a way that is more public transport friendly, and that would be a better way of solving the issue. But certainly I think it can help us resolve the issue of some of the developments that there's been in the last few years.
Cool, thank you. Now, I've just got a question here to clarify. Rhys, you might be able to answer this one. So the 25% drop in passenger numbers relates to former Call Connect figures or figures from inception of Just Go. Can you just clarify that 25% drop you referred to before?
Yeah, so the 25% drop in the second and third lockdown was against when we weren't in lockdown with Just Go. So based on the September, October and bit of November and bit of December figures. So they're not comparable to the Call Connect. It's more around when we were operating without restrictions. And yeah, that was in comparison to what we'd seen around 60% drop on our local bus services, and potentially even more on some of them as well.
Cool, thank you. Now I've got a really interesting question here. Rural DRT seems like a huge challenge to me. How do you deal with the lack of route choice? I might get Ben to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think rural DRT is a challenge, and I think it's a battle. Well, I say a battle. There's always going to be compromises, I think, with DRT in rural areas between what budget is available to support a DRT service and the ability to get the resources in the right place at the right time. So, you know, using North Lincolnshire as an example, it's 30 miles east to west, but it's not 30 fast miles, and there's a river that runs partway through, you know, north to south with limited crossing points. And I think that does cause challenges because it's a simple maths kind of says, you know, if you've got 3 vehicles that are up in the northeast of the county, and somebody wants to book a bus down in the southwest of the county, there's going to be fewer vehicles available. And part of the work we've been doing is to get the vehicles into certain locations for their start and finish time and meal breaks, so that there is more chance of people in the areas where there might be lower demand being able to get booked on. And I think this is where being able to use the data and the operational experience really does come in. But I think also this is where you've got to, and I think we touched on this a couple of times in the presentation, move away from the sort of Uber style booking where, you know, you book an Uber and it turns up in 3 minutes, and if it tells you it's going to be 9:53, it'll probably be 9:53, to actually saying, are we better off having more of a range, which is what we have now, so that if you want a bus at 10:15, well, actually the system will look either side of that, and whilst it'll still give you a time and the bus will turn up at that time, you know, if you want it at 10:15, it might actually say to you, are you happy to travel at 2 minutes past 10? And that just gives more flexibility and more scope to get more efficiency out of it. So I would say it is challenging running it in a rural area, because you don't have the sort of density of demand, and the journeys are longer and the time it takes to get places longer. But it can work, but it will be different from an urban solution. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Cool, thank you, Ben. I've got another question here. Are there any penalties for the passenger for booking a service but not turning up? Who wants to answer that one?
I'll take that one, yeah. Yes, so if a passenger doesn't cancel within 30 minutes of the journey time, then they will still be charged. Obviously, if it's a concessionary passenger who hasn't paid or isn't paying, then obviously they won't be charged. In those cases, and that we've only had a few, we're able to identify those and educate the passengers as to why it's a problem not showing up. And the driver can also call the passenger on the day to see if there's any issues if the passenger's running late. So it hasn't been too much of an issue, but there are those controls in place.
Cool, thank you, Rhys. Now I've got another question. How do you decide on the fleet of buses? How many, the service times and the area coverage, etc.? How do you pull different orders between different vehicles?
Happy to jump in on that one. So in terms of how we pull the orders between the different vehicles, that's all done by the algorithm. So essentially, we'll match together people who are traveling in similar directions and put them onto the same buses. So that's automated as part of the system. When we're talking then about how do we decide on the fleet and the shift times and things like that, so we essentially have a set fleet in terms of size. Doesn't vary, and we're just trying to get the most out of that fleet that we possibly can. And the shift times, start locations, break points, things like that, that's all things that we've been evolving as we've been optimizing the service. So after the first few weeks of running, we can see where and when people want to travel. We can move the start and end locations of the shifts to different places to best meet that demand. The break points, there's 10 breakpoints that have got appropriate facilities for the drivers. Those are flexible within the routing that happens, so that they just happen wherever is optimal for the driver. And then the shift patterns as well. We've done quite a lot of analysis to make sure that we're covering the busiest period with as many of the shifts as possible. So yeah, it's part of that ongoing optimization process that I talked through before.
Thanks so much, David. Now, we're just up to our last question because we are almost up on the hour and we want to honour your time. So I'll just read out this last one. So what roughly is the percentage split of Just Go bookings made by phone to the call centre and remotely via the app? That one's probably for Rhys or Ben.
Yeah, so the split's around 50-50 at the moment. We did see an increase in the percentage around app during the lockdowns, probably because those people are traveling regular journeys for their essential journeys. So there was less leisure travel, so less one-off bookings. But the app percentage has grown since we launched. It was probably 60-40 the other way around when we started. So we're getting people to kind of get used to the app and realize the better experience they get through the app. But as I mentioned, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a good experience without the app. And we don't expect everybody to do that, and the call centre will always be there.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rhys. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but thank you to all of our attendees and to our speakers, to David, Ben, Rhys and Kevin. Now, if you did miss out on having your question answered or you have more, you can actually contact the panelists directly. So please reach out. They'll be happy to discuss with you. What we'll do is we'll send out a link of the recording as well of the webinar so that you can review this on demand. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining and have a great day or night wherever you're from. Signing off from Liftango. Thanks.